Hello and welcome back to class. In today's tutorial and demonstration video, we're going to be diving into collage. Collage is a fantastic medium. This is going to be an introductory into collage. So rather than kind of going into all of the nuances and the eccentricities of collage or the history, rather I'm just going to talk you through the process of collage itself. We're going to go through a couple different phases in our video where we talk about different aspects of collaging and thinking about getting into the mindset of how to create an image with assembled images. So first off, part one of the video, we're going to be diving into resource materials. So how to collect materials, how to start maybe thinking about or engaging with the ideas around collage, how it can be beneficial, and how you might start manipulating collage strategies in your work. Part two of the video, we're going to be diving into more crafting of collage. This is going to be a quicker little section, but we're just going to talk about some archivability, glues to use, ways to think about substrates like papers and stuff like that. And then lastly, some kind of cutting that's going to be needed for your collage. And then the third part of the video and final portion of the video, we're going to actually be making a collage where I'm going to just talk you through my process. This is going to help give you some kind of maybe visual information on how I think about constructing image. So we're going to talk about composition, lines, we're going to talk about line kind of unification, juxtaposition of ideas or symbols, also thinking about color, shape relationship, and form continuity. So there's going to be some really great stuff and sections in that portion of the video, so feel free to stand by and watch that. That section is going to be time-lapse, and I will be talking you through certain sections just to make sure that you're understanding how I'm thinking about or processing image construction. So without that, we'll go ahead and dive into our video on collage. Let's go ahead and dive into part one of the video, sourcing for materials for collages. Primarily, I'm going to recommend that you hit up your local thrift stores or rummage around in your basements or attics for printed material. Essentially, what you're going to want to look for is old newspapers, books, magazines. All of the material that is in front of you right now on the screen has actually been sourced either from thrift stores or friends of the library sales. And primarily, we're just going to start talking about the basic collage process. And collage is essentially talking about assembled images, right? It's taking images out of their original context, either cutting them or pasting them onto a new context and creating new form, shape, and meaning relationships because of the juxtaposition or assemblage that you're creating. So collage itself, like I said, is a really powerful medium. It's really beautiful, and it's a very easy way to start images, primarily because you're already working with material that has image, texture, color, form, shapes on top of them, and then essentially you're just using your own artistic skill and vocabulary to create a new context, theme, or concept by the way you assemble them. So this is a really fun and exciting material, and I really hope you enjoyed this process. I particularly love collage, so I'm a little bit passionate about talking about it, so I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do. But essentially, like I said, any type of 2D material, this can be old kind of postcards that you find of your favorite artists. This can be gemstone books that have just a lot of great texture and a lot of great visuals for, you know, form or for cutouts or either texture or background information. Often I like to think about macro and micro when making collages, and what I mean by that is sometimes you'll have micro shots of like something really small or particular that's going on in a surface or a zoom in shot, and I'll actually like to use those as like a macro shot. So I'll actually end up cutting down maybe a section of this like zoom in of a gemstone, and I'll actually use that as maybe grass in the foreground. So there's a kind of fun kind of place too where you can play around with the meaning and even the understanding of the original context of the image and resource that and kind of flip it on its head in some ways to create new meaning and context for your images. So think about too how you can use maybe a lot of different types of books with just good visual information and resource them and make them into your own meaning. You can also use, like I said, magazine catalogs or library catalogs or even art museum catalogs for collections that they might have, and even resource some of those artist prints or images and resource them and make them into a new. Nat Geos are probably one of my favorite and like most kind of go-to in terms of just like collaging materials. You can find a lot of Nat Geos surprisingly in thrift stores, and they're actually relatively priced. Good magazines too with just large kind of editorial images like this will also be really fruitful for collage. And like I said too, don't just focus on main subject matter, but also look at those background or foreground shots, or maybe there's texture or planes that you can use to create new kind of information. Also, like I said, think about the context of the image. Perhaps we might see a kind of scuba diver swimming under some ice here, but perhaps this maybe turns into a cloud space, or perhaps this turns into a mountain range, or even maybe texture of a shirt or a dress pattern on a figure. So think about too how you're going to maybe take some of this image, resource it, and reuse it for your own creative means, okay? Also, other things that you might want to find too are things like maps and newspapers. I end up kind of grabbing a lot of different maps from thrift stores and reusing them as either backgrounds or textured information on certain areas of my collage. A lot of times too, when I'm doing this, I'll end up cutting down large sheets and kind of using my favorite kind of images for collages. And then I'll just kind of start stacking them next to each other and start thinking about form relationship, color relationship, shape relationship. Often when I'm thinking about collage too, I'll really start thinking about how maybe some areas kind of start and stop, like where this kind of grassy knoll or wood goes out of the frame, and then maybe it connects with another larger structure on the other image. So think about connection lines and form connectivity. And that could be something that you start to create some really interesting meanings and some really beautiful connections between the work. Also playing around with different contexts and thinking about image relationship with using framing devices. So sometimes too, I'll just find an interesting passage of an image and then I'll cut that out and then I'll use it as a frame to frame something else in a work. So this actually can become a collage method too, where you start thinking about how to frame another piece within a frame, quite almost literally in this case. But this could be a really beautiful collage method as well. Essentially, this method, you're going to essentially kind of create moments like this. So I tend to work with a lot of landscape, or currently I'm working with a lot of landscapes in my own particular work. So I've got a lot of landscape images. But this is a kind of collage, or maybe I take certain sections of those sheets that I find from that printed image sources, like old books, magazines, newspapers, things like that. And I'll cut them down into these kind of usable parts and then start maybe thinking about how I can use these usable parts in an overall collaged image. So essentially I just have this on a piece of paper. I painted the background this kind of like nice earthy tone. In some areas you can see it popping through. And then I'll just start cutting up the image and then start creating layers of image on top of image to create a new kind of landscape work. So this is going to be, primarily me just using images that I find in a page, cutting and pasting them onto a substrate, and that's the collage process for this type of method. So you can get a lot of high results from this, a lot of beautiful marks, a lot of interesting form and texture and color relationships that can be really well nuanced, really well balanced and harmonious with just thinking about how to source those images, cut them up, and make them for your best uses. All right, so that's going to kind of show you the introduction into some basic collage methods with using source materials like found magazines, newspapers, maps, images that you might find from, that kind of printed media. In addition to that, we can also start thinking about how, I'm going to put my books off to the side, sorry, give me a second. We can also think about using our own kind of visual resources that we have had as maybe students or as artists for a while. There might be old drawings or paintings or prints that maybe you have made in the past that perhaps just aren't serving you now and you just don't like them, but you've kept them around because you're like, maybe I'll have a use for this later. That's actually a perfect kind of medium and material for collage. So think about if you do have some old photographs that you have and maybe perhaps you just didn't like the way they turned out, perhaps you start cutting those down and those actually become either a ground, aka a surface in which you're going to build your collage images with that found resource material that we just went over on top of, or perhaps you start cutting it down into smaller shapes and start using it as other collaging materials to go on top of one top of the other. You can also not only use your photographs or old digital collages that you've made and printed off and cut them down, but you can also use things like your drawings. These are some old scrap drawings that I have that I like, but I just haven't really, I don't really know what to do with them. So I could also use this kind of material for collaging, right? And these are just simple graphite or pen and ink drawings that I have made that, like I said, I'm just not totally sold on, but I just don't have the heart to throw away. So perhaps I either cut them down and start using them in new contexts with new collages, or perhaps too, you have some old Sumi inks lying around. A lot of Sumi ink drawings lying around, and perhaps you really hate Sumi ink, and you started, just collecting maybe some Sumi ink drawings that you just want to repurpose. For me, whenever I make a Sumi ink drawing, I really, like to play with mark with Sumi ink quite a bit. So I'll have a lot of these test sheets actually lying around after I do a Sumi ink drawing, like anywhere from like 2 or 3 or maybe even 5 of them kind of laying around after I do a final Sumi ink drawing. And whether I want to keep my Sumi ink drawing or cut it down, or perhaps I use these test sheets to create new kind of collages. In fact, I've got an example here too. This is actually a little demo that I did for another class talking about Sumi ink. This is actually all made off of Sumi ink test drawings that I did, or test mark pages. So essentially what I did is I just cut little pieces out, and then I just started organizing them in a landscape type composition until I ended up with a collaged Sumi ink drawing. So essentially this is just making kind of use of my scrap test materials and turning it into a collage, an abstracted landscape. So this is a really beautiful use too for thinking about repurposing or upcycling some of those old projects, giving them new life, giving them new context, aka that's the power of collage, right? And creating some really interesting, unique works that you might not have normally made, right? And I also think that's the beauty of collage, and I want you to really take hold of that process, is that collage is a really freeing opportunity because it allows chance in to your studio practice, where perhaps you may have not seen a form, shape, color, or value relationship in the same context or in the same way until you started cutting up those pieces and setting them next to each other, right? So it's a really intuitive process, but also too, it's an area where you get to really play with a lot of images. And when we're working with found images, it's a much easier process because we can just start saying, yes, I like this relationship. No, I don't like that relationship. And then once we have an image that's really fluid and movable, then we can start playing around with the context, easily making really interesting, compelling works that are conceptually motivating and maybe revealing, but also formally and aesthetically appealing. So we can play around with those kind of skills that we've been developing all year long. And all throughout our artistic practice, to create really striking works that we might not have had the opportunity to create in the past. So that's kind of one method too, thinking about reusing old either photographic imagery, using old drawings, or using right here, or using old test sheets of discarded kind of Sumi ink drawings or whatever, to create new, meaningful and beautiful collaged works. In addition to that too, you can also think about painting works. So I've got a variety of different painted forms and different paintings that I do throughout the semester for classes and things like that. I'll do a lot of test sheets similar to some of my Sumi ink drawings, where I'll talk to you about how to create a gradient, how to create different textures or wipe away paint, or create interesting textures with using saran wrap or other kind of non-traditional materials. Even old paintings like this, I can actually tear up and create new collages with. In fact, too, I've got some old test sheets too, where perhaps I'm working with like an ink or a kind of acrylic, and I'm wanting to build up those layers in a really interesting way. And so maybe perhaps I do test sheets as well, which I've got plenty of lying around. And perhaps I start to make a collage off of that. So this is actually a good kind of area too to play around with. Perhaps you start building a ground in a really abstract way, like this piece right here, and then perhaps you start working over that with little bits of acrylic paint spattered all across this page. And then perhaps you use some of that found resource material from books and magazines and newspaper clippings and all that good stuff. And perhaps you cut out a really interesting form, start using some of that drawing and with some pen and ink, going over it with a color pencil in some areas to tone down some of that blue. And then voila, you've got a really interesting and beautiful collage space that looks really compelling, really exciting. And then this could also be a great way to make studies for paintings, right? So making this space a really interesting form for a larger painted work or even a larger drawing work in the future. So collage not only can serve itself as its own medium that stands on its own, you can frame this, aka and sell it, right? But you can also use it as a way to create studies or to create drawings for yourselves for larger works like paintings or drawings that you might want to do in the future, because this is such a quick process, right? So this could also be a really good method too, just thinking about recycling and reusing some of those paintings that maybe you don't like anymore, or some of those test paintings that you've done, cutting them up or using them as a ground to build off of with other found images or even other found paintings and drawings, okay? So you can think about this too as like a mixed media process, where it doesn't necessarily just have to be found image, right? It can be found image, painting, reapplications of paint and drawn line works, going over it with markers or color pencil in this case, and even drawing around and starting a ground off with paint. So this could be a really multimedia process where you use the collage aesthetic and use the collage assemblage to create really interesting dynamic forms. All right, other kind of components that you can think about in terms of collage is also kind of using other found papers. This is some old paper that I made a couple years back. And as you can see, this is a really interesting kind of textured form here. We've got some really great color to it. It's got a lot of wonderful texture from some of that blue and some really beautiful bleed of color. So this is not only a really aesthetically beautiful piece of paper, but this could serve for a really interesting ground plane for other collaged or found images to go on top of. I also have here too an area of cut paper, and this is actually my Copic marker was running out of ink and I just didn't want to do any drawings with it, so I just ended up coloring this piece of Bristol board that I cut out. And now this actually acts as maybe an interesting plane where it's maybe starts to generate a mountainscape that can exist in the background. And like I said too, I can even take other forms like my old drawings and even start to layer other forms on top of that or behind it to create really interesting mountain spaces or really interesting new contexts for other forms to exist on, right? So this can become a really interactive process, like I said, in multimedia process, where you really think about form relationship, color relationship, line, mark, and texture all in the same breath. In addition to that, so also thinking about too, perhaps maybe you start taking some of this beautiful found paper or made paper and start adding other kinds of images on top. And I just want to do this just to give you a quick little relationship on what this might look like. But this could be a really beautiful little space too, where you start to play around with shape relationships. And like I said, this in itself is actually a beautiful little collage, and you really don't need to do much more than that. But you're thinking about maybe the aesthetic of that rounded mark and that pop of color relating to the image on top. So also thinking about form harmony and color harmony, as well as shape relationship harmony. So this is another area of multi-complexity that you can start to interact with collage, and becomes a lot easier because you've already got a found image that you're working with. So then you just have to respond to those other images or background spaces or papers that you're using to create that beautiful collage link, okay? All right, in addition to that, like I said, there's a couple of other kind of materials that you could source or use. So I'm just going to pull a couple into frame. The first are some techniques that I love using called transfer techniques or transfer images. I don't necessarily show or talk about these techniques in length for this particular video. If you are interested in learning about them, however, just shoot me an email and I'll send you a video link where I fully dive into 3 main processes for image transfers that I use on a regular basis. So I do teach you how to use this one in that particular video. So like I said, if you are interested in creating an image like this, just let me know and I'll send you the link. So transfer images, and then the second method too is thinking about creating toner images and toner scans. So we'll go ahead and talk about the transfer image first, and we'll just put this to the side. These are essentially a transfer image that I like to use quite regularly in a lot of my paper paintings. So my paper paintings are kind of paintings that I use in my own practice to kind of help speed me up or to create smaller works in a little bit faster way. So what I'll do is I'll end up making a digital collage, and then I'll end up printing that off, doing a transfer process onto paper like this, and then I'll have an image left over that'll serve as a ground for me to build on top of with collage collage materials such as found images, or either go on top of paint or draw on top of that. So I'll just show you one of my collage little images. Essentially, this is kind of a similar process. So I've got areas where I have kind of taken like our found image like this, and I've actually just cut out, and they're fragments now, and it's just sitting on a piece of white paper. And then, like I said, I'll either go over that with paint and mark, even some areas where I use paint skins, or some, like I said, paint that I'm just toppling on top of or dabbling on top of, and that's kind of the end result. So some of this, like I said, can also be cut down. This can not only be used as a ground, but also cut down and make other kinds of collage images on top of and all that good stuff. But this is a really great process. And like I said, this one in particular, these didn't turn out as good as they normally do just because I was rushing the process and I used a different paper. So I have a lot of like areas where the image didn't fully transfer. So that's why you get a lot of this grain or speckle. And sometimes that's fine. For my paper paintings though, I didn't really necessarily like this for my current series that I'm working on. So I'm actually just going to end up turning these into collages. So what I'll do is I'll go back over this maybe with a layer of glaze and just tone the whole entire space, giving it a color. And then I'll possibly cut this up or maybe use certain sections of it to establish maybe a ground or either foreground or background information for a collage in the future. So transfer images actually can be a really helpful process for your collaging materials in the future. All right, the next thing is thinking about toner images. So these are actually images that I made at the library for like 25 cents or like 50 cents, right? They're really cheap, kind of easy methods. Essentially what I did for this one is I ended up taking some drawings like the ones that I just had not too long ago. So abstract little drawings like this that I'll cut up and then I'll re-stitch together and then glue or tape them back together. And then I'll end up scanning them in to a toner image and then just printing them off into a black and white copy like this. The reason I like to do this is because it takes an image like this where I can make this quite easily, and it is able to transfer that process in a way that I could have not thought of, right? So it's another context for giving myself some chance and some creativity in my art process, just to take some liberties where I may have not seen that kind of shape relationship or give me a new understanding of a space, something like this, right? So think about too, going outside that bubble and really pushing that boundary of what you feel comfortable with to give you a new image result so you can have maybe a better chance relationship or maybe see things in a different context. Also too, sometimes I'll just scan things that I find in like a toner image, and then I'll cut them down into little shapes of texture like this. So then I can start thinking about how maybe I can start combining them with old drawings. And once again, collage is about the process of, you know, image relationship, right? How to take symbols, whether those symbols are drawings that you've made or paintings that you've made and resourced, with images that you found or just image to image relationship, and creating new context between those two relationships. And of course that can get really complicated because maybe you have like 50 images in one collage, right? But that's the kind of power of collage, right? You can use that narrative of taking texture, taking pattern, taking form, and taking symbols, right, aka images, and either reversing their meaning or starting to question their meaning by placing them next to other objects. And this is maybe not as complex as you can get or maybe as industrious that you can get with maybe conceptual meanings, but you can just think about process relationship here, or surface relationship, right? This is a highly surfaced ink and paint little drawing or study that's next to a very flat image that's hyper detailed of a zoomed in landscape, right? So you can start to see too how this abstracted drawing starts to change and almost turns into a digital texture, right? Or digital landscape texture. So there's some really interesting, not only kind of formal decisions that you can start making, but you can also think about the conceptual ramifications of stacking images next to other images. What those symbols are going to start to apply when they're juxtaposed next to symbols that they aren't normally seen in. Change the context, right? The context is the power that you can start working with collage really easily. All right, so that's going to go ahead and break down our first part of the video. That's the introduction of how to maybe start thinking about collage, as well as how to assemble materials and collect those materials for your collages. Let's go ahead and dive into part 2, and we can start diving into all of the wonderful crafting components and ways to actually assemble those objects and images. let's go ahead and dive into crafting for your collages. So when crafting a collage, I always start thinking about this from the ground up. So thinking about that substrate material, essentially the layer of paper on which you're going to start building your collage. Now, of course, you can use, just basic found image materials like from magazines, and then that be the base material for your collage. I don't recommend that though, because there's some strength issues, meaning that this is a really flimsy support. And even when you start laminating this with glue and paper, it's just not very strong. So I always like to teach good crafting and good kind of archivability. So I always like starting my collages actually off of a substrate paper base. And I have some really nice kind of quality papers, artist papers that are in front of you. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them this might be new. So I'm just going to go through a couple of them. There's obviously a couple of different options that I don't have in the frame either. But really, any kind of stronger paper that's a higher artist quality is going to be the best thing for collage making. I recommend highly working with either boards like Bristol board, watercolor paper, and or printmaking paper like BFK, Reeves BFK, or Arches Cover. So that's actually the papers that I have in front of me right now. You can also use other things like a nice heavier weight drawing paper. I am going to caution you though, with your drawing papers, they're not used or particularly good with any type of wet media. So if you are going to do any type of painting or watercolor or working with a really kind of large application of glue, I might steer clear of this particular option and go for more of a water kind of friendly paper or board, something that's going to hold up and not wrinkle or get kind of crummy on you, okay? All right, so like I said, the printmaking papers are probably one of my favorite for working with collage. They're just really great, really strong papers. You can use wet medium on them. They don't like have any issues in terms of like holding up. They're archival, and like I said, they're really strong. So you can really do a lot with them, and they're going to be able to take some abuse. So this is both Reeves BFK, and then primarily most of this is just actually Arches Cover. So this kind of light cream is the Arches Cover, and then these kind of roughly chopped lighter sheets behind, that is the Reeves BFK. So my Arches Cover here is really fantastic. I've already got this cut down into some pre-cut sheets for me. I'll tend to do this too. I like to work in a couple of just generic sizes, and I'll have some cut down so then I can just kind of bust them out 1, 2, 3, right? So really quick. I also have some kind of fun shapes here too. I've been playing a lot with this in my practice where I cut down some non-traditional kind of frames for my pieces. So these weird like round forms, or even taking two rectangles and squares and kind of gluing them together for these like weird boxy structures. So also think about too your frame. Once again, as a 2D kind of person, you're already going to be well aware of thinking about the frame as the first kind of compositional choice for your particular works. That doesn't change when you get into collage either. You need to think about the frame and how all of that kind of visual information is going to be relating to itself and the frame. All right. Other kind of papers that I have in front of us are some watercolor sheets. I've got some really nice watercolor. This is a hot press watercolor, so there's not as much texture or tooth on the surface. This is about 300 pounds and then a 200 pound watercolor paper. You can really use 90 pound or 140 pound. I recommend 140 pound plus for anything with water, just primarily because it's going to hold up a little bit better. It's not going to wrinkle as much, and you're not going to get as much distortion or rippling in the paper when you wet it, okay? Other papers that I have too are boards such as Bristol board. I've got smooth Bristol board, and then I've also got vellum Bristol board. The big difference is just the tooth or surface. The smooth is smooth. It is primarily good for inks and markers and all that kind of good stuff. Your vellums are really great for color pencil, chalk pastel. You can do some ink work with them too. It's just typically your smooths are a little bit better for that. But it's a really good all-around strong paper, the vellum is. So these are kind of the papers that I would highly recommend for collage substrate construction. And like I said, when I'm working on a collage, I usually figure out what size of frame or what shape of frame, in this case, I might be working with. And then I'll essentially cut down an image, and then I'll just simply glue it on. It depends on the type of paper you're using and the type of image that you're working with on the glues that you want to think about. So this is going to get us into our next section of crafting and considering how to think about your collage. And that's thinking about the glues that you'll use. I've got a couple materials in front of us. These are really popular glues for collaging and things that I like to use in my own collage practice. We first got some matte and gel gloss mediums. Essentially, these are just clear acrylic bodies. We should know this pretty well in my painting classes, but these are just essentially clear acrylic paints without the pigment in them. This is a really great glue for any type of collage medium. And sometimes too, I'll like to go over the collage, especially if it's a stronger paper or if it's like a painting that I'm working with or a drawing that's really strong paper. Sometimes I'll even go over it with like a gloss or matte finish just to kind of give it an all over surface texture. I'd only recommend that though if your paper is not going to ripple. So anything under 140 pounds, I would not do that with. So just as like an FYI. Or if it's, like I said, if it's painting, you're probably fine to do that with if you want to do that. So those are great, really wonderful products to use. Typically, like I said, I'll go back and forth between a gloss and matte, just depending on what I want to use. Other kind of materials are going to be traditional glues, like your tacky glue, any kind of PVA white sizing glue like this will work. Elmer's, right? Things like that will work really well. Modge Podge is another really great collage material. Tacky glue and Modge Podge, there are some differences. They both are going to act very similar to white glue, and for lack of a better word, Modge Podge is pretty similar chemically to white tacky glue. There's just a couple additional additives that are in Modge Podge to kind of create a little bit stronger material. So if you're wondering about those differences, or if there's any kind of big difference between them, kind of in a way. I like to tell people this just to give them a little bit more material knowledge. You can also do some transfers too with Modge Podge. And like I said, it's a really strong material with some additional binders. So if you want something a little bit stronger than your traditional tacky glue, try the Modge Podge. And then glue sticks. So you're going to really think about these topics or these kind of materials and how your paper weight's going to work. So I'm going to essentially divide the frame up right now. My wet materials or wet glues are going to be over on the left-hand side. That's our matte mediums, our traditional PVA sizing tacky glues, as well as our Modge Podge. This is really great for materials that are stronger papers. So anything, like I said, that's going to be watercolor paper, images that have a really strong kind of board, or like I said, if you're grabbing things from a book, typically those papers are a little bit stronger. You can use these particular materials on and have no issues with craft or material warping at all. When you start playing with newspaper or papers that are really thin and delicate, that's when you want to switch gears and work with your glue stick. So I like to have this kind of like size, weight kind of determinant between how I think about these materials. Anything like 100 plus, you want to use your wet materials, or you can use your wet materials. Anything below 100 pounds weight-wise, you want to use your glue stick. Otherwise, if you're using really light, delicate paper, like I said, like newspaper or some drawings that are on regular drawing paper, your paper is going to ripple a lot. So you're going to notice kind of that really gross, ripply surface, just some issues with your image in general, and just some overall warping that's going to look really gross on the surface of your collage. So that's when you're going to want to avoid really wet glues like the ones over on this side and use your glue stick instead. And like I said, for harder materials, those thicker, heavier boards, most likely your glue stick, depending upon your glue stick, this is a really good brand that I like to use a lot. Sometimes this will work fine, and then sometimes this just isn't strong enough and those images will pop right off. So that's when you want to switch to your heavier, hardcore wet glues, okay? So that's going to be kind of a summary on glues, how to think about them, how to use them. Let's go ahead to talk about cutting materials and what you might need for that. So there's basically going to be two things that you're going to need for cutting instruments. That's an X-Acto knife with plenty of X-Acto blades, and some really good pair of scissors, or a really sharp pair of scissors. So I've got just some regular, my studio scissors here. They're pretty sharp, and I use them pretty exclusively for cutting paper and things like that. I have an additional pair of scissors that I use for tape and gluey sticky substances to make sure that they don't kind of cross, and I even have them written out on on my handle here so I know not to dabble. But I also am going to highly recommend having a cutting mat as well. My cutting mat's really large. It's actually behind me in frame. It's the blue mat behind me. It's a little large, so I just didn't bring it in frame for this. But make sure you have a cutting mat whenever using your X-Acto knife. This is going to help you save your blades, and it's actually going to be able to create a better cut. So that's going to be helpful too for this process. To release the blade, all you have to do is turn counterclockwise on this little textured bit of top metal surface, and then just pull off your X-Acto blade. Make sure to wrap the tip up so you don't cut yourself or it doesn't poke through your garbage bag or trash bag. And then to put this back in, essentially you're going to look for that little slit in the metal. And then you're going to put your X-Acto blade in it and then turn clockwise to tighten it up and make sure that's really tight, okay? Then from there, you're just going to essentially cradle your X-Acto knife in your palm, right? I usually like to have my index finger on my blade. Depending upon the type of cut that I'm making, if I'm trying to make a straight cut, I usually work like with this, cradled in between my palm and have my index finger on my blade just to help secure it. Or like more like, it's probably more like that. It's in between my blade and the kind of gripper. When I'm doing detail work, I'll actually use it more like a drawing or writing utensil, right? So I'll kind of work like this, and then I might even use my left hand to hold down certain bits as I cut things out, just to make sure that I don't tear the paper, especially on really delicate stuff. Like when you're doing some of your really detailed cuts where maybe you have to get into these fine little curvilinear lines where maybe you have to be really delicate in some areas too, where you have negative space popping through and you have to cut that out. Often I'll kind of cut like this, where I'll have maybe my fingers holding down some of that space, and then I'll be able to cut through and then kind of work along and go slowly. Once again, when working with any type of sharp or exposed blade like this, just make sure that you're being mindful of your fingers and you're being mindful of where the blade is and your space. If you are working on a flat surface, make sure the blade is pointed away from you. It's also not horizontal to your body, so in case if it rolls, it doesn't roll towards you. Usually when working, I have some kind of tray over to the side, and then I'll just take my X-Acto blade and just put it face down in that canister or container, and then I'll be able to just kind of work with it and just put it back into that spot, okay? So that's some good just little crafting tips, so make sure that you're using that. Like I said, scissors, make sure they're nice and sharp. You're going to most likely be cutting with the very back of your blade, and depending upon how large some of those cuts are, even some of the front of the blade. Typically, if you want a better cut or a sharper cut, meaning that's a little bit crisper line, you're going to want to work with the back of the blade because there's going to be more vertical force. So that'll be really good. All right, let's go ahead and talking about maybe cutting techniques where you might have to think about these forms. So in general, I really like to work with my scissors most of all. I feel like I have the most control with them generally. That doesn't necessarily mean that's always the case, but for the most part, I end up trying to cut mostly with my scissors. So we're going to look at some positive forms here, and then we're going to look at a negative form. So these are some positive forms of of 3 different images. So for the most part, I had these objects kind of being cut out. So I would just cut a square out, and then I would go into that object and cut into the space right here. For areas that I have to use the X-Acto knife, it's for these little recesses or those little peek through areas of negative space where I wanted to cut out some of that form. And then from there, I'm just really careful. And like I said, I work more in a fashion where I'm holding it more like a drawing instrument, and I'm cutting through that space. And often I'll hold that image really still as I cut. My fingers usually do get pretty close to the blade, but I want to stress this point. Make sure whenever you're cutting, you're just paying attention to those fingers that are holding your image down, and you don't actually get them close to your blade. So often they get close, like I said, but they're never directly in the line of the blade like this. I don't want to see anything like this, or don't do this, because this is a really good position for you to cut yourself, okay? Especially too when you're doing a lot of these or you're making a lot of little detail cuts. Sometimes you'll get really confident, and that's usually where you'll end up nicking yourself. So just make sure that your fingers are never behind the blade when you're holding the image down, that they're always to the side, all right? So that's going to be the big kind of things for cutting. And like I said too, you're going to have some positive and negative forms. And I want to highly stress using both positive and negative forms in your works. So this is just a negative form of my cactus cutout here. So as you can see, I went in with my scissors and I actually cut this whole entire space out pretty much with my scissors. And I got a little bit of areas where maybe the image connected too much and I had to go in with an X-Acto knife and just cut it a little bit. But this is actually done all with my scissors. And this is actually a really beautiful form here. So I want you to think about too, not only using your positive forms, but also your negative forms as well. And think about that relationship. Things that I really want you to maybe not do as much is just being lazy with it and just giving us these square edges. Sometimes when I see this and works, especially if there's not a lot of other square kind of lines or shapes in the image, this can totally kill a collage. And so once again, that brings up that idea of form continuity and shape continuity and line continuity. Can I say continuity one more time? Anyways, but what I mean by that is essentially if you're working with a lot of curvilinear forms, those forms are going to look similar to one another. They're going to have some visual harmony because of that unification of likeness. When we start adding really hard edge geometric forms like this, especially in this range and this vocabulary of shape, this could kill our form really easily, right? It just looks like a big blunt edge next to all of this really beautiful, delicate information that's so textural, so vibrant, and relates so well to one another. So really think about your collage, maybe how you can start going into it, and really taking it the extra step and creating more of a sophisticated image that does more formally and starts to relate well to the image that's also that's actually on it, right? So think about that kind of substrate that you're cutting away, the paper you're cutting away, and how it's relating to the edge and to the image inside of it, okay? There might be some areas too where maybe you have some straighter cuts here, and maybe that starts to relate to some of the images and how they're forming there. So you can also think about too, like vertical and horizontal lines, how they're operating, what's the flow or speed of those lines in the image, and maybe how you can start working with those, or like I said, maybe going in and editing that line in that edge of the image so it's a little bit more relatable to the other forms and contexts of the other images, all right? So not only thinking about line continuity, form, shape, continuity, all that good stuff, but also thinking about using both positive and negative forms to help promote a really interesting image, because like I said, that's that chance thing that could come in. When you have this little scrap image left over, you're like, yeah, that's kind of a cool little form there. Maybe you can turn it upside down, maybe it can go horizontally, and maybe, like I said, perhaps this starts to turn into like a shadow space and really something kind of interesting where perhaps you start playing around with your figure ground relationship or figure ground reversal, okay? All right, so I think that's pretty much it in terms of mostly working. There's other good forms that you might want to have around, or other good materials you might want to have around to help your collage process, and that's things like tape or delicate tapes, like washi tape, or even some really delicate paper tape like this. Usually what I'll do with this is I'll have this kind of sitting around, and sometimes, especially when you're working on really complicated images, I'm going to just pull these forms out once again. Let's say I have them in a particular order and I really like that order. Let's say I like this shape, right? Sometimes kind of reassembling your collage to glue it down is the hard part. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll just take little bits of tape, and this is a really delicate tape. In fact, you can see like my finger actually on it. This is a delicate surface tape, and this just came out, I think, not too long ago. Depending upon how old this video is now, right? This is, if I'm using this like 10 years ago, it's probably, or 10 years from now, it's probably gonna be really old. But anyways, this is a delicate surface tape. I just started using this. I don't know how long this has been on the market, but I just started seeing it not too long ago. I really like it. It's essentially washi tape, basically. It feels very similar to that. But it's a really light tape, and it's gonna have a really low tack. What I do even sometimes to that is I may even put it on my skin or even put it on my clothes just to pick up a little bit of residue that might be sitting on my clothes or skin, and then I'll be able to put that on my image, and it'll be really low tack. So essentially I can easily pull it apart without worrying about the paper being ripped up, and then I don't have to worry about, oh gosh, my blue is now like paper pulp and holy, right? Versus I can just kind of tape it down, and then I could say, okay, my image is going to sit there, this image is going to sit here, right? And then maybe I'll say this image is maybe going to sit right here. Pull it up, put it on my fingers for a couple more times. And then that way I have an image that's pretty stable. It's not going to go anywhere, right? And then from there, I can just lift this up, use some glue sticks to kind of coat the main back form, and then have them stick on and be put on an image. We'll just do this right now. And then boom, that's my collage. That actually looks kind of cool. So I actually kind of like that. Maybe I'll save this one, right? And then you have a collage that's functioning now, right? So that's actually a pretty cool looking image. There's some interesting cuts too that are coming off of the image. Like I said, I actually kind of like this. This always happens, right? So this is the beauty of collage, right? Some beautiful chance things happen that you didn't necessarily foresee. But yeah, so that tape can be really helpful in the process just for good crafting and also just keeping the images in order. So I might recommend having some washi tape, or like I said, if you have any blue painter's tape, this is going to have more tack on it. So just take some of that off. And like I said, either put it on your sweater so you can lift up some of the burrs or fiber from your sweater. So it's not as tacky, right? Or even just kind of put your fingers over it a couple of times just so it loses some of its tack. Then tear it down into little tiny small sections and then just tape those images together so you don't lose their place or order, okay? All right, other than that too, other materials that could be useful, like I mentioned, collage is kind of a multimedia process in many ways. So it's very easy to kind of dip into some acrylic painting, working over it with colored pencils or gel pens or regular ink pens or even sumi ink. So have fun too with the materials that you use. Charcoal and graphite also could be good substrates, or kind of, not substrates, but good materials to manipulate or continue to manipulate your images. So have fun with just playing with other materials. Also other materials that I like to use, and you saw me pull this into frame earlier, but things like glitter. I love using glitter quite a bit. I have a lot of different types of glitter. This is just like one of them, one of my trays that I have. But I have like things like embossing powder. This adds really great visual texture. That's really dynamic and really quite beautiful. So I'll use embossing powder, and sometimes, like I said, I'll just even paint a little area with my matte medium or gloss medium, and then I'll just pour this on top, and I'll kind of take my image, and maybe it's like vertically sitting, or kind of sitting up from my table, and then I'll just kind of sprinkle it over, and then just kind of pat that down, and have kind of some of that glitter just being lightly caught. Also too, I've got more kind of traditional like sparkly glitters and other kind of shaped glitter that you can use and add into your painted or drawn collages or just image collages. So this could also be maybe a process too that you experiment with just having some other different types of materials. You can also use some other small three-dimensional objects such as like fuzz or I don't know, I've seen a lot of different things in collage. Like I said, shaped glitters. I've even seen some small objects too. Just make sure too, when you're working with it, that they are fully attached and that they're not too like abrasive to the surface. Sometimes that could be an issue just carrying them through spaces, and if they get hit, maybe they pop off, and that can be damaging to your image. So just be careful when you're working with more three-dimensional objects and they are fully affixed to your paper surfaces. Let's go ahead into the making portion of this video, part 3, where I'm going to show you how to make a collage and just talk to you about my process and think about some formal image construction ideas. So to start off my process, I usually have quite a bit of piles of just images around me. Images that I've been collecting and really kind of copiously going over and going through and really fine-tuning and picking out. And of course, this is all based off of things that I like as well, that kind of fits my narrative and my concept and ideas. And to begin, I just kind of start layering things. I just start trying to play around with materials, play around with how images are looking and working together. Sometimes I like the way things are working, sometimes I don't, but usually I have to start off my process with just kind of getting my hands dirty and just playing around with images and as they sit next to each other. As you can see, I'm just right now playing with old drawings, playing with some image fragments that I kind of have already cut out and that I've saved for later. I've got image transfers over on the side, and actually some somewhat finished collages too, and drawings in the frame. So as you can see, I'm just kind of playing around here, and in fact, this is kind of a part of my natural process. I usually take maybe about 20 minutes, 30 minutes to get warmed up in the studio. Sometimes this can be used for drawing or sketching, or sometimes I just have to play around with images. Usually playing around with images, especially when I'm working with collage and doing collages in my projects, help me the best. So for whatever reason, I just have to kind of do that, and that's a part of my process. So this is also going to be a fun part of this exercise, is really getting better to, or getting more aware and familiar with your own kind of art making process and sensibility, how you start to make images, what are your habits and routines, and what actually works best for you. Now, this could change too as you develop and grow as an artist. You may notice at different times in your life you may need to do different things. You may need to cultivate a different type of practice, or start different types of engagements with your work, either to throw off your sensibility, or to either just kind of allow you to think in a different way, or just because your artwork and your life has maybe changed. So you need to be flexible, you need to be responsive, and you need to pay attention to what your mind and art needs for that particular time. So at this point, I've kind of cycled through some images. I've kind of played with just some images on top of each other, looked at other drawings, and then I ran across this image. And this one actually is really interesting to me. I like the colors here. I like maybe some of the opportunities that I'm seeing to kind of play with positive and negative space. So I've decided to kind of dive in and work on this piece. As you can see, I'm going to be working and introducing quite a bit of cutting tools into my collage process. Primarily, I'm going to be working with an X-Acto knife, and this is a new refleshed blade. I do recommend working with a lot of blades when you're working on collages, because you will need them. And my second cutting tool is, of course, going to be scissors, so a good pair of sharp, handy scissors. So for me, I'm just going to actually start diving into this. Of course, I've got a self-healing mat under me. That's what this kind of grid space is, that black and white grid space underneath. So I can just cut freely on this board. I'm going to go through and just start cutting out images. The way I'm really kind of thinking about this space is that I really want to develop pockets and fissures. So I'm going to play with both the actual positive subjects and negative spaces to kind of create both kind of this illusionistic perspective of pockets in space that are being exposed and not exposed to the viewer. Also, I'm going to think about sensibilities where I want to treat the negative space as a figure, and conversely, I want to think about the positive spaces as a background space. So I kind of want to reverse roles here and really play around with how the viewer is perceptually seeing space and how I'm also composing an image. So as you can see, I'm just kind of playing around with image placement here. And this is going to bring me to a really important step and something that I want to bring up about collages in particular. Sometimes, depending upon your image, you're going to notice that a white page will absolutely kill your collage. And this is something that I want you to pay particular attention to. Sometimes you might have to colorize your background image. This could be a variety of ways that you approach this process. For me, I'm painting my actual image. So I'm working with Arch's cover as a foundation. So that's a water accepting type of paper, so meaning that I can work with an acrylic paint on top of it. It won't warp and it will accept the water media pretty easily without fuss. So you're going to also want to think about your substrate and your boards. I do highly recommend working off of a substrate, whether that be paper, and then you just build images on top of that paper. It's going to make for a stronger collage and just better crafting sensibility overall, versus if you just work with magazine images and just build up off of there. Sometimes that can lead to some bad crafting issues, torn paper, ripped paper, warped paper. So it's just better to start off with a strong foundation. So for me, I decided that I really did need to paint this image. I just took two complementary colors, so that's a good way to neutralize a color, and I kind of got a darker kind of warm, kind of muddy mauve color. And I'm just applying that with a brush here. I'm using a kind of palette on the side that you can see that I just kind of mixed in, and I'm going to create a slight gradient in my actual painted image. So I'm going to pull out some matte medium, and I'm just going to slightly work with my brush. I'm working with a sable brush to create a slight gradient. The matte medium is essentially a clear acrylic paint without the pigment, so it's going to allow for even brush marks and brush strokes to really create some nice blended and textured surfaces for me to work on. As you can see, I'm not being super rigid with how it's being blended in, but rather I just kind of wanted a little bit of extra pattern and texture. But as you can see, it has a nice kind of well worked in and kind of well aesthetic feel to the top of the image now. So I have a background that's set and a color theme that's going to match the images that I'm working with. This will be often very, very important when you go to work with collages. So I really want you to think about the holistic image, and I want you to think about the background color. Often I see sometimes what kills a collage straight off from the bat is students just working with white paper and they're not thinking about the background. Collages really rely on every area of the page really being activated. Not that that's not true for any other drawing. It's just I find with collages, students just get kind of lazy with the background for whatever that may be. So I want you to really think about that background. Now there may come a time too where you're working with really delicate images or scientific images, or you just need a lot of white space, and that's totally fine too. But I really want you to think about how you're handling the background, whether you're showing the white of the paper, whether you're toning it slightly, or whether you're working with a variety of crafting papers that maybe naturally already have a texture on them, or perhaps you're layering a variety of white papers. You can even think about incorporating some printmaking techniques like sheen collage, where you take different colored mulberry papers or mulberry paper in general and apply it with a wheat paste or a light glue and create a variety of different textures to your front surface. Whatever that be, just make sure that you are considering that background. Okay, some helpful tips that I'm doing. So as you've noticed, I am going through and cutting quite a bit of images out. I'm also playing with my positive and negative space. I'm cutting into backgrounds. I'm cutting also into those sky spaces, creating some interesting textures, and reworking those negative spaces. As I mentioned, that's going to be kind of a part of this concept here. I'm really wanting to play with those boundaries of how we understand positive and negative space, what our actual subject is, and distorting those fields of perception a little bit. So what you're noticing here too is some crafting tips that I could give you in terms of keeping your images in place. As you can see, I have little tiny pieces of tape that are holding down some of the main images that I already know where they're going to be placed. I'm also working back and forth too with scissors and X-Acto knives. Sometimes it might be easier to cut an image with a scissor versus an X-Acto knife. So really think about how that image is going to work and be formed. But getting back to that taping can be really, really helpful, especially when you have decided where you want an image to be and you're working with multiple layers and everything's starting to move around too much. So take little bits of tape, make sure that's not too sticky. So even take those little bits of tape and stick it up to your sweater so that lower the tack of the tape, and then stick them to your image, to the background. So that way, when you go to glue them, it'll be nice and easy to find where they are actually located. All right, so what I've got here is I am just lifting my tape up and those images up, and then I'm putting a piece of cardstock underneath my image. So this way I'm able to use a glue stick to fully coat the image, but also keeping it in place because I've got those little tabs of tape. Make sure whenever you're gluing, and this is a big crafting tip here, that you're always working or gluing on a spare piece of paper and you're paying attention to where that glue is actually on that scrap piece of paper. There's nothing that will kill a collage and craft like collage like glue and gunk up on your images. So make sure you're really paying attention to that. As you can see, I'm creating different levels of value and I'm constructing an image that really has some great color harmony and balance just because it's using all of the same types of colors. This is a great way to organize an image. Think about how you organize color on the color wheel, whether that's a monochromatic, analogous, triadic, tetradic, complementary, or split complementary color system. Make sure it is a color system that is organized on the color wheel and you're using some color theory here to balance out your image. As you can see, I'm going in now and just adding some layers. I'm kind of just playing with the boundary. I moved these images around quite a bit. This is also something that I'm going to recommend when you're working with collage. Make sure you try a variety of different orientations of an image. This could be not just necessarily the up and down version, but maybe shift it on its side, flip it upside down, tilt it in an axis, overlap them, or even tuck images under one another. Really start to play around with the element that collage operates so best, and that's fluidity, right? Collage is about really being able to have access to movable image. So you really want to think about how your shapes and lines are going to interact between objects. So whether those be symbols that are actually like human beings or trees or something,
think about how your shapes and lines can connect to one another, how they're either going to create a whole image or they're going to merge into other images and create new images or new landscapes. And this is going to be a huge tip, especially for creating content in your work and creating a meaning in your work. Now, whether you're doing something like me where you're starting to play around with landscape and our perception of landscape, or just how we perceive spaces, and it has a little bit more loose kind of or more open kind of space that you're physically working with, or if it's something more specific where you're actually working with more direct symbols, like you're playing with metaphor and allegory in your actual narratives. Think about how, once again, physically those images are going to line up to one another. What is going to be the balance there? Is there going to be positive and negative space interactions? How are the values going to work? How are the colors going to overlap or overlay? So always keep those elements of art and principles of design fresh in your mind when working with an image. Also, like I said, make sure to play around. Now, as I mentioned, there is going to be a variety of different glues that you have at your resources here, and the glues are pretty much open. As you can see, I'm pretty much working with a glue stick, and that's primarily because these are all images from a Nat Geo article or a book that has a similar kind of paper to Nat Geo. So it's a lighter weight paper, and it's just not going to be able to hold up with a darker or a heavier kind of weighted paper. So that's why I'm using a glue stick. So make sure to pay attention to crafting qualities and what kind of paper you're actually working with. Okay, so I'm pretty much coming to a close at my actual drawing here, or my collage. So hopefully we'll get you to an end result, or you can see the end product here. But remember, have fun, play with details, play with lines, play with shapes and how they interact and engage. This is just a few pointers. Of course, experiment and really play. Of course, you don't have to just work with images. Also feel free to bring in some drawings, make some marks on top, paint on top, or add little objects into your image. Have fun and enjoy the process and the freedom that collage offers.
At this point, the collage demo is pretty much done. I have provided some extra content for the next little bit of work here that I'm going to do. This is just me working in my studio and just making some more collages in kind of a group fashion. I'm not going to talk you through the process since I've kind of pretty much articulated my style, the way I think about it. And of course, there's more nuances than probably what I went over. But I just thought I'd provide some extra content and some other information just to see how maybe I work or develop a group of collages. So feel free to watch. I'm going to put some music on. Otherwise, happy drawing, happy painting, and most of all, happy collaging.
if you've made it this far in the video, we are nearing the end. So hopefully you've seen some additional processes just from watching this last little bit about talking about collage and adding a little bit more mixed media and just getting to see a little bit more about making collages in a series. So hopefully this video has been helpful and instructive. I hope that you have a fantastic time making your own collages and enjoy the collaging process. So as always, have fun drawing, painting, and of course, collaging.